Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is David McDannald. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
You have written a book that I could not put down. It is called The Last Great Ape, A Journey Through Africa and a Fight for the Heart of the Continent. And it's a wonderful cover, and the contents are even better than the cover. You co-authored this with your friend Ophir Drury.
That's right.
And it's on a conservation and a massive cosmic frame, it is absolutely compelling. But in terms of an adventure story, and you can't put it down to find out what's going to happen. This is a beautifully written book, so welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lorraine.
So tell me a little about yourself, because I can see you're a wonderful writer. How did you become a writer?
Well, I had a far more traditional upbringing, let's say, than Ophir, who knew from the very beginning that he was going to be a radical. And I grew up in Houston playing tennis, playing baseball. When I was 16, my parents sat me down in the living room, this kind of traditional, I guess, rite of passage for kids, and implored me to get a job, to embrace the responsibility of my age. And I left childhood thinking that I would be a businessman. That's what we did in Texas. We played sports, we competed, and we went on to own buildings and this kind of thing. And I found myself at Goldman Sachs after university. But I really didn't know at that point what I wanted to do without role models. And I figured there are a lot of worse things than working in New York for what was then a more celebrated company. And it was there really the feeling that I had when I arrived that really spurred me to introspect and figure out what I wanted to do with my life.
And how did you meet your co-author?
I met Ophir at random in Kenya 12 years ago. And at that time, Nairobi was a really dangerous place. It was actually nicknamed Nairobi. There was a good chance if you walked outside at the wrong time, you were going to be mugged. So there was this great safari company. Actually, it was the very cheapest, bare-bones safari company in Kenya, and they had army tents set up on their roof. And so only the hardiest travelers were there because they didn't have water, electricity in the building. And that's where I met Ophir, actually. He was playing guitar behind a door. Interestingly, with Ophir, he didn't even want to be around backpackers and Peace Corps and VSO people. He was there because he was friends with the Kenyans who worked there. And so I heard guitar behind a door and opened it, and there he was.
Well, you've had many adventures together, and you sort of, you trace his odyssey, because in 2003, he founded, do you call it LAGA, L-A-G-A, the Last Great Ape Organization. Yeah. And it is an NGO. It's actually the first wildlife law enforcement NGO in the world, created to enforce the existing laws, which nobody was enforcing. So talk a little about what the need was and how he stepped up.
Well, Ophir was working as a photojournalist at the time, and he went to Cameroon, the jungle, and he was going to write an article about bushmeat trade, about the slaughter of endangered species. And Jane Goodall had predicted that within 20 years, apes in the wild would be extinct. This was 10 years ago or so. And he was going to write an article and publish it. Then he was going to get back to doing other things, writing about human rights. And he realized that in Cameroon, no one was doing anything to enforce the law. In fact, the government ministry set up to enforce the law. The people involved in the ministry, the officials, were actually market makers in the selling of bushmeat, were actually facilitating the slaughter of animals. And he also realized that the conservation NGOs, the big organizations, environmental organizations, weren't doing anything to encourage the government to enforce the law. And he kind of fell into it. He was totally disillusioned by what he found in the capital, that animals were being slaughtered and really nothing was happening. Everything was corrupt. And he went to the bush, to a jungle town, and within 5 minutes of arriving there, he learned that there was a baby chimpanzee held in the house of a poacher. And for every live orphaned ape in the pet trade, it's estimated that there are 10 adults that have been slaughtered. So they can't take, it's impossible without, I guess, nets and cages and things to take an adult chimp. So what happens is the family will be killed for meat, and maybe an orphan will survive. And Ophir saw this chimp in the house of the poacher, and the poacher offered to sell it to him. Now, the chimp was despondent and kind of just closed in on himself and was being treated like a rat. I mean, the people there were kind of feeding him cassava pieces, little bits of food, and then pulling them away. And the chimp was really had been reduced to an animalistic state that was not characteristic of healthy chimps. And Ophir decided that he was going to try to confiscate this chimp. And after he did, he actually bluffed the poacher into, Ophir basically, he said that he worked for an NGO and that it was his job to enforce the law, a law that the day before the poacher could have gotten out of for a $3 bribe. And Ophir confiscated the chimp, and the chimp adopted him as his father. And the great moment was in the house, in the kitchen of the poacher. So the chimp has been tied up with a rope around his waist. The walls covered with the stains from old fires. There are beer bottles on the floor. And Ophir finally unties the rope from the chimp's waist, and the poacher is saying he'll run. And Ophir backs away and extends his arms like this, and the chimp comes to him and embraces him and is transformed into a child, essentially with needs that are almost as complex as those of a human. And that chimp, adopting Ophir as his father, set the course for the last great ape.
And he says that unbidden, he became mother and father to this creature, and then ultimately was able to place him in the sanctuary for little orphan chimpanzees. So he did the right thing. But it did, he said, start him on this incredible odyssey. There's a United Nations group called CITES, the UN Convention, CITES, on International Trade in Endangered Species. And I think the thing that shocked me the most was that organized crime is in this. It's big business. And he said, we're not even going to say how much money can be made because it'll make people want to come and make all this money. But between the lion skins and the ivory tusks and the trade in chimpanzees, I am really, it was compelling reading, but there were people kidnapped. His own employees were kidnapped. He was under death threats. This is very dangerous. Tell us a little about some of the things he went through.
Well, he risks himself on a daily basis. He was recently in South Sudan, the new country, helping to train their police force, Ophir was. And the first day that he was out of his flat in Yaoundé, the capital of Cameroon, it was broken into. The second night, he had a policeman stay in the house, and it was broken into again. The policeman managed to yell and drive these people off. And, I mean, bigger threats are that Ophir, as he has built his political capital in Cameroon, has taken on larger and larger challenges of going after corrupt judges, of going after sub-ministers, people who are at the ministerial level, and trying to root out corruption from the ministries. And just to give you an example of how endemic corruption is there, that in 90% of their court cases of arresting a wildlife trafficker, putting him through the legal system, they've documented corruption in almost 90% of their court cases. So there are basically enemies built into his entire way of life. Now, the interesting thing to think about is how well he built a persona, or how a persona was built for him, and that is that he started wearing black, mainly because black is a color of utility. I mean, it hides dirt, right? And, if you don't have running water in the pipes, well, I mean, cleaning your clothes is really down on the list. And he started to hear that the only people in Cameroon who were all black were witch doctors. And so he didn't do anything to dispel the image of that. And then he runs basically a ring of spies, that he has people throughout the country who are posing as buyers of lion skins or posing as buyers of ivory, and they wear hidden equipment. Hidden cameras, hidden microphones, and people started to talk to his undercover spies, and unwittingly saying that there's this new guy, this guy who wears all black and he has powers. But there's a more kind of conscious defense that Ophir has used, and he was in the Israeli military for 4 years. And one of their principles is when in doubt, attack. And with Ophir, actually, when he started Laga, the airport was filled with people who were selling ivory curios. You're going home to see mom, or you're traveling to see an aunt somewhere. Well, buy her something, right? This is part of our culture too. But in these shops. There was ivory for sale. All of this is illegal under Cameroonian law. And Ophir, one by one, started to arrest all of these guys. So then he arrives to the airport one day. There's no more ivory for sale on the airport. He arrives to the airport, and a man comes at him, the shoulders back, and he says, you put my brother in jail. You put my brother in jail, threatening Ophir. And Ophir gets out of the cab. As he's getting out of the cab, he takes a business card from his pocket, and he puts it in the man's hand. Of course, Ophir is scared. I mean, this is traumatic, but he puts the business card in the man's hand and says, my name is there, my address is there, I'm waiting for you. And he keeps walking because this sense of upsetting the balance, right? The man who's aggressive, when the tables are turned on him, he's not sure what happens. And there's another idea that the lion doesn't attack the zebra that it thinks might put it at risk, right? So if you make yourself appear just a bit off or just a bit crazy, then someone will think before they act. And thankfully, so far, Ophir has managed to stay safe.
He does that in another situation where a dealer is arriving with a chimpanzee, and there's all this manipulation that has to be done. You can't have them in their house. They have to come out. They have to be holding either the lion skins or the leopard skins or the animal, and then you bust them on the spot. Mandatory 3-year prison sentence, right? At least in Cameroon.
I think for a Class A endangered species, it's 1 to 3 years. I mean, often they won't get that many, and they'll get a few months. But before Ophir arrived in Cameroon, the law had never been enforced. The law had existed, I think, for 9 years, and it had never been enforced. In fact, for almost all of Africa, for all of West and Central Africa, these laws existed and had never been enforced. In Kenya, they do have effective law enforcement for their wildlife, but they have millions of tourists who come to the Masai Mara every year to see the wildebeest migration, and even that doesn't guarantee that the government will protect wildlife. But Ophir was responsible for the first prosecution. Within 1 year of saving Future, the orphaned ape, from the poacher, he had the first prosecution for wildlife law in an area, say, the size of the United States. So this was almost an unprecedented act.
Now, there's another, the public health aspect of the bushmeat trade, because a lot of the diseases that are plaguing us now, say, have come from, I don't know whether we could, who knows about AIDS, but some have said that it was from the interface of the bushmeat and humans, and Ebola also. There's just rumors that this is not a good thing to do. So there's the corruption thing, there's the decimation of these endangered species, and then there's the public health aspect. So there's reasons to be doing this, and now he's had over 400 arrests. He's really changed the culture. And the other thing that I love is not only has he done it in Cameroon, but it's been exported to other neighboring countries. But he's not just doing it for the wildlife anymore. For students to get into college, they sometimes have to pay a bribe. For a person to get their car registered, they have to pay a bribe. And now he's got this anti-corruption hotline where anyone can come forth, and he will help document the corruption and end it. It's a revolutionary act that he's doing there to change that, the basic, so much of the third world, it's just, the mordita in Mexico, the bribe, and then to finally shine a light on it and say it doesn't have to be like that.
Right. Well, in Cameroon, it's even worse. And in Cameroon, people die in the hospital for not being able to pay a bribe to their doctor, right? And for Ophir will deny the influence of biology and animals in his life. I mean, he truly loves animals, but the cause for him has always been larger than animals were really the toehold. And he's built this system for rooting out corruption in the courts. And the idea was, well, we've done it effectively to fight back against wildlife trafficking. We should really apply this on behalf of the people of Cameroon, right? And the idea there also is that people, once empowered, can speak for themselves in a way that animals cannot. And I mean, his program for activism has been adopted by the Peace Corps. The people in other countries have used his program. He wants this to live on beyond him, that he wants something that transcends his own ability to be in place at one time. And LAGA, his organization, is replicating in many different countries. But the most interesting thing about it is that not only are they helping to enforce wildlife law and fighting corruption, but that within the organizations, the spirit of activism makes Ophir want to take someone who's a dependent activist, someone who's come to his organization, right? Who's maybe worked an office job or something like that. So who's an activist maybe in their heart, but has never actually put his or her skills to use, and then to learn how to be an activist, and then to move on. So Ophir wants people to move through his organization onto other things. And the real testament to this, and I hope as his dear friend and an admirer that it becomes a sort of movement, is that in the other places where LAGA has offices, new offices like Gabon, Congo, Brazzaville, that the same thing is happening that happens in Cameroon, that people are coming to work for these organizations, and then they're leaving to start their own NGOs. They're becoming independent activists.
And he was on the radio, and people would write him and say, "I'm so inspired by what you do." And I just want to read a little quote from the book because it's so powerful. So people say, "I'm so inspired, I want to give you money. Will you take donations?" And he says, "Well, giving money is the way out. It's a way of releasing the pressure to do something positive. But if you are inspired, there are better things you can do with this feeling. Use the energy to do things in the same spirit. It doesn't have to be in Africa. It doesn't have to be big. There are so many things that are waiting for you to come and change." That is so inspiring to me. And there are people who suddenly realize, well, I don't have to be, it's called collectivism among, that there's activists who just think if they click on a petition online, or they send in money that they've done their bit and they're done. But some of the people like Chris Hedges and Michael Ratner say, to be an activist, you really have to get out of your chair. And I'm thrilled to think that people start working with him and then spread out and go into different other areas.
Yeah, Ophir is really motivated by a sense of responsibility, by principle and responsibility. And I'll tell you a story from the book that he was traveling across the Kenyan bush. He walked halfway across Kenya dragging a camel. He had taken a camel because he was in an area where there was no water, no drinkable water. The camel, in theory, was going to take his water. And he was basically passing through villages with the idea that, well, I can take something, some bit of wisdom or some jewel from this culture and move on. And he was in the process of kind of building himself, of moving so far from his own life that he wanted to slough off everything that he inherited from his culture, and was rebuilding it by traveling through new communities, isolated communities in Africa. And he finally got to Sierra Leone. And in Sierra Leone, he was there when Foday Senko, who was the rebel leader of the Revolutionary United Front, was actually marching on the capital. He didn't time his arrival for this to happen, but Foday Senko and his men got closer and closer to Freetown, to the point where they were just a few hours, easily one night away, perhaps just a few hours away. Ophir was unable to evacuate. British planes landed and took all the expatriates out of the country, and Ophir's fate was tied up with the Leonians as they feared that Senko's men would invade the capital, as they had 18 months earlier, and decimated the city. They had slaughtered 5,000 people. Now, British paratroopers managed to land and push Senko back, but in the process, Ophir learned what was at the heart of the Leonian people, and is that they were a people of incredible tolerance, almost to the point of nobility. And there's one man, it's a quick story, his name is Mukhtar, and Mukhtar was the chairman of the amputees camp in Freetown at the time. And Mukhtar, so he led a community of about 400 victims from the war. And Mukhtar's story went like this. About 6 months before Ophir arrived, he was walking through the capital. There had been a tentative peace accord. Some rebels had disarmed, others had not. Mukhtar had lost his arm and his ear. And he was walking through the capital, and he saw two men, and he said, "Do you recognize me?" And they said no. He said, "You held me down, and you cut off my arm." And the men scrambled their pockets and held out money. And Mukhtar said, "I don't want your money. You thought I was dead, but here I am. But I let you go in the name of peace. I forgive you." And this wasn't the exception. Over and over again, Ophir heard lessons of incredible forgiveness from Leonians, and it was a gift for him to have been there, to have survived and to have heard this story. And he felt, he'd never conceived of himself as a journalist, but he felt that after he had heard these stories and witnessed what Leonians had gone through, that it was his responsibility, it was his duty to publish a story. He knew that he could, therefore it was his responsibility. He wrote an article and it was published within 1 month in the Israeli equivalent of National Geographic, a magazine called The Nature of Things, Teva Hadbarim.
Yeah, the book is so full. You've written those stories so compellingly. We don't have much time left. I want to look a little bit at the big conservation groups, because he was one of the first wildlife law enforcement NGO, but there are all these other great big NGOs, non-government organisms or organizations, yeah, that we think are taking care of it. You know, don't worry, you know, I won't even mention them. But what he found, you know, tell us a little about that he thought they were helping save the Sudanese refugees. They said, we don't want volunteers. We're in our big fortress. The refugees are out there in the tent. So he went out in his tent with the refugees. So he was disillusioned with what the conservation, he says, the trend has got to be into action, not just PR pieces.
Well, if you arrived, he arrived near to the border of Sudan, Kenya and the Sudanese border, and he had traveled with Sudanese refugees to the camp there. And he pitched his tent. I mean, imagine this. He pitched his tent outside of a refugee camp. He was completely out of money. He had no food. The refugees themselves were giving him food. And he wrote a letter and he sent it into the compound. Now imagine this kind of Wizard of Oz, this giant city of organizations that's just built basically in a destitute area where the refugees themselves are living in tents, but inside the fence are SUVs, are giant satellite dishes, is a real facility of communication. And his idea was, well, I want to help the Sudanese. I mean, whatever, if I have to serve food, if I'll hoe in the fields, if I'll just fill out paperwork, I want to volunteer on their behalf, just put me to use. And so he sent a letter into the compound, and very quickly, 2 Kenyan police officers came and basically harassed him and told him to leave. Like, we don't want you here, go back to Nairobi, the capital. And he said, well, you know, I'm not leaving. And then a woman came who was head of the entire UN operation. And Ophir said, you know, I just want to volunteer. I just want to volunteer. And she was aggressive, saying, well, who do you think you are? What do you think you're doing here? That's the problem with Israelis. You think you can just do whatever you want to. He said, please tell me if I've done something wrong. I simply want to help. I see the Sudanese are in need, you know, war-torn people. I'm here. Put me to work. And she said, it's unbelievable. She said, you really think there are volunteers here? You really think there are volunteers? And pointing back at this massive NGO city, you won't find one volunteer at this aid camp. Everyone here has a salary, has a job. Volunteerism is passé. That's what she said. Mm. And Ophir left. There was nothing that he could do then, but he kept that in his mind with the idea that could he find people to disprove her, to disprove this new model that activism, that the aid business, right, it truly is a business, is about protecting salaries, is about lifestyle. If we get to bring it back to Cameroon, that you have the conservation NGOs. In Cameroon, they were there at the time when Ophir arrived, and they were doing little more than putting on workshops. I mean, it's just whitewash. Yeah. They're putting on workshops for the very corrupt officials who are making a market in bushmeat. It's almost, you know, the protectors like actually facilitating the slaughter, right? And they were giving out equipment to these same people. So, you know, budget for a wildlife organization, $5 million for 2002, sensitized 250 officials. This means nothing. They paid those officials to attend their workshops. So with Ophir's prodding, his idea was this kind of organization has no measurable standard for whether it's doing its job. And Ophir said, what I want to do is create a new kind of organization where, you know, with a business, if you're making TVs, if your TVs don't work, the consumer will decide, hey, you shouldn't be making TVs. But in the aid world, there is no measurable standard. So he said, here's how you'll judge us. How many arrests have we made? How many arrests have led to prosecutions? How many bribing attempts have we thwarted? How many articles have we published to try to encourage people to seek other means of making money, to dissuade them from going into the bushmeat trade?
And by the way, he has won, Laga has won many, many awards, including the Future, what was that one?
Future for Nature Award.
Future for Nature Award. But I want to come back to the woman who said that volunteerism is passé, because at the end of your wonderful book, you and Ophir say, activism is not passé. Caring for a cause is caring for your own existence. The difference between an activist and a non-activist is the understanding you have the ability to make a difference. It doesn't feel like altruism, it just feels natural. And that's just a beautiful thing that we want to call forth in people, that you don't have to give away money or click on a petition, but there are things that you can do in your own community that need to be done that will feel natural. And you know, I'm so grateful for what you've done, of course, for the great apes, and that's a whole other show in itself. We have to talk about what's happening, but the scaffolding of your life and his life and how you communicated in this book is really something to be very proud of. So I thank you for it. What do you're on a book tour now?
Yeah, just a short tour to the Southwest.
And are other groups, have they come to you and asking again, how can we use your model? Have they been on other continents even?
Wow. Well, the Peace Corps, as I said.
Yes.
And there was a man I think it was in Congo Brazzaville. There's this tiny anecdote in the book about a man there was a young girl who had been sexually abused. And in these kinds of legal systems, literally 90% of the time, you will have bribing attempts. I mean, the judges, the magistrates, everyone can be bought for a price.
Yeah.
Ophir actually right now has some bogus court cases against him. He arrested the biggest wildlife dealer in Cameroon, who was a parrot trapper, a gray parrot trapper. And this guy has paid off who knows how many members of the judiciary, and Ophir's hauled into court once every few months and harangued on the stand and basically berated the guy accuses him of having tortured him. Ophir wasn't even in the same town when the guy was arrested. It's just, but they're trying to disempower Ophir. But from the larger point of view, Ophir really is dedicated to principle and responsibility, and he asks for no remuneration. It's really, in my opinion, he honors old ways in doing so and puts himself at great risk. And so, I mean, he's my dearest friend, but also a role model.
Well, you've done him a great service telling his story as well as you have. And I thank you. Our guest today is David McDannald. Thank you very much. I cannot recommend this enough, The Last Great Ape. I'm Lorene Mills. This is Report from Santa Fe. Thank you for joining us.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.